Good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. As far as I understand, the conversation will be difficult because we will touch on many memories that may have remained somewhere in a distant memory. Thank you in advance.
Thank you for taking the time to come to our country to tell Ukrainians about what unfortunately is not available to them today. This is very important for my country, for our people, and for me personally, because we, the people, have a completely different position, unlike our authorities. We support Ukraine. We stand for the Ukrainian people and wish them victory.
Over the past few days, we have communicated with many people from different fields of activity, different ages, different social groups, and so on. And I have concluded that they all have a very sensitive perception of what is happening now in Ukraine, not as if it happened somewhere far away in another country, just sympathy, but this is connected with their experiences. And we have probably opened up this bleeding wound, connected at least with Abkhazia, because you are from there and you remember it. Is this historical moment in Ukraine really so important for the Georgians? And what do you expect from us?
Your question is very well worded. It is very significant for us, based on the fact that I personally come from Abkhazia, despite the fact that almost 30 years have passed since the loss of Abkhazia, which is temporarily occupied. This pain doesn't disappear. It sits deep in my mind and in my heart. I live with this, and the tragic events that are now taking place in Ukraine are refreshing these wounds. Every day since February 24th last year for me is the return to Abkhazia, the reliving that pain, that tragedy, which, so to speak, was mothballed. I tried to forget it. I tried to leave it in the past. But it turned out to be stronger than me. And today, together with the Ukrainians, I feel every day filled with pain.
What was revealed to the whole world is this incredible cruelty of the Russian military in the Kyiv suburb, in the east of Ukraine, in each deoccupied city, and the finds are getting worse and worse. And finally, the world heard not only about Ukraine, but the world began to find out what was happening in Georgia at that time. Why didn't they shout about it so much then? Why didn't we know all those terrible facts? Is it all in time? And what should we do now with this information, which is also being revealed with Georgian history?
I absolutely agree with you. Unfortunately, the photographic material of the events in Bucha, Irpin, Izum was a kind of a déjà vu for us. I have already seen all this in Abkhazia. Many have personally experienced this terrible tragedy. The picture is almost identical, no different from the nightmare that took place on the territory of Abkhazia. You probably remember the Gagra tragedy in 1992. The Sukhum tragedy was already 13 months later, because for 13 months it was continuing in the only non-occupied city every day and was part of our life at that time. Unfortunately, these pictures does not exist today. There's very little information about those tragic events in Abkhazia, and probably for many reasons. Technology was not so developed then. Ordinary citizens could not record those events in this way, and the international community at that time did not reveal special interest to the events in Abkhazia. This is the reason why many have just now discovered what Abkhazia has gone through, what we have experienced.
There is such a concept in the legal plane, without a statute of limitations. It's probably the same. Now this information will be revealed. Probably in the near future, many other facts will be revealed. The question is, what to do with this information and what do you expect? Do you expect that people will be punished? But this will not make your soul feel better anyway, and you will not return these years. And the second question is, how to continue to coexist with these people there? Do you see the possibility of reunion with these people? I may be getting ahead of myself, but how is it supposed to happen? Forgiveness, or what will it be?
Возможность воссоединения с этими людьми. Как это должно происходить вообще? Вот как это прощение, что это?
You have asked a very difficult question, so much so that time I'm looking for an answer to it, and I cannot answer it myself. Although one thing is important, until everything comes to the surface, is not brought to daylight, it is very difficult to talk about reconciliation and tolerance, because today's society does not know the whole truth. Many facts have not been made public to this day. Correct assessments of the Abkhazian war have not been made. To this day, those people who took part in the artificial inspiration of this conflict have not been punished, and their names are heard only on the sidelines. This is not a sign of status, but this is important. Sooner or later, this will be written on the pages of the history. The truth will definitely break through and win. But there is still that pain between us and the twin nation, who for centuries lived side by side with us on the territory of Abkhazia. And we must definitely find ways to bring them home. It is very, very important. We do not consider the return of Abkhazia and Ossetia to Georgia militarily. No, we have already gone through this. And we know what war is, the loss of people, a human tragedy. This is a nightmare for both sides. We are considering the possibility of resolving the conflict peacefully. Well, our society is not ready for this. One of the reasons why this doesn't happen, why we do not take certain steps, is that first we must tell each other the truth. We must forgive each other. Necessarily, both sides. And we must realize who our enemy really is. We are not enemies to each other. We were artificially alienated from each other by the occupier, which is the Kremlin. This is an empire in which destruction, annihilation, death, alienation of people and ethnic groups from each other is in the blood. And we must be aware of it and overcome this.
Perhaps it is going to be an unpleasant question, because I didn't know that you have internal communication with those territories through the newfangled means like TikTok and other social networks, through streams, and I was surprised. Although, why be surprised if the majority of people in Donetsk and Luhansk who remain there have been under the influence of 9 years of propaganda there? There was no alternative information, but there was fear and intimidation, and their attitude to life and understanding of the processes have also been reformatted to what is happening there in Ukraine and how Russia is involved in it. And I see this flow of hatred from the Abkhazian territory, an unpleasant question, but what is happening with these people there now? What do they want? I have already understood what the Georgians want, but what do the Abkhazians want, and is it possible to return their normal, adequate perception of reality?
Вернуть назад их нормальное, адекватное восприятие жизни.
In the territories occupied by Russia, an absolutely identical policy is being pursued. First of all, this is informational propaganda, the narratives of the Kremlin, which is very strong, and unfortunately this works with a certain segment of the population. Today, in the occupied territories of Georgia, as well as in the occupied territories of Ukraine, a huge part of the population is a victim of the Kremlin's informational propaganda. Based on this, there is an increased aggression of the population, because for so many years they have changed history, created new history textbooks for Abkhaz students, where the Georgia is presented as an enemy. This is how Abkhazians raise their children. And it is very well calculated, even though the platforms you mentioned, like TikTok and etc., are very good means of communication, which give young people the opportunity to receive the right information. We have illustrated examples of how peers become friends. With the help of such platforms, many Abkhazians move to the territory controlled by the Georgian authorities for various needs, and not just to receive healthcare services. This is very important, because sooner or later this huge Kremlin propaganda machine will collapse, and people will be able to get the right information. In general, we Georgians are very tolerant. Often this turns into naivety and even stupidity, but I like it. I found it in myself when I had to communicate with Abkhaz patients, and I'm glad that I don't have this negative attitude or disgust. I sympathize with them and look forward to the day when they will wake up, sober up, and understand that with Russia, their identity is simply doomed. The nation as an ethnic group will simply physically disappear. We have a common coastline, and compare today's Sukhumi and Batumi. What a difference between them. How our coastline developed and how Sukhumi, which was huge potential for development, got stuck in the Soviet era.
We will return to these memories later. When you fled from Abkhazia, you were a teenager. You were not the Minister of Health and you had a different perception. More on that later. Now we have touched on your professional activities, and I wonder how this communication with the occupied regions took place, because you are a government in exile. We have a slightly different story because Luhansk and Donetsk were represented by the military-civilian administration and the processes were mainly controlled from Kyiv. Yes, they could leave those territories before a full-scale war and receive treatment in the free part of Ukraine and have access to all the services. How did you build it? This is a government in exile. There is a territory that you cannot enter, but they can come from there, get treated. What function did you perform as the Minister of Health of Abkhazia?
In general, this is a slightly paradoxical format for the point of view of conflictology. If we compare it with a similar situation in the world, this is really a special case. I was a member of the legitimate government of Abkhazia, the Minister of Health and Social Protection. This is a government in exile that was re-established in 1995 in Tbilisi. And my personal sphere of supervision was the population living in the occupied territory of Abkhazia. But this issue itself is divided in two parts. This is the Gali district, where Georgians historically live, persons who have citizenship of Georgia and are citizens. And the second part, it's outside the territory of Gali. It's Sukhumi, Ochamchiri, Gagra. This is the territory where the main part of the population is non-Georgian ethnically. Now, unfortunately, even Abkhazians are not in the majority there. We have developed special programs and projects, which is very important for the peaceful settlement of this conflict. In practice, I managed to establish daily contacts with the local medical staff, and with such direct communication, the evacuation of severe patients was possible. Severe patients are admitted daily and by self-report. This includes cancer and many other systemic diseases. We try to help them as much as possible because many regions in Abkhazia are not developed at all and their medical infrastructure is in a deplorable state.
The first question is why the Armenians go there, and the second is that there is a completely free border there and the Russians go there like to a resort. What is interesting to them there? I am remembering Montenegro. Here is Budva, for example. It's terrible that they rebuilt it according to their vision, but at least they poured money into it and made the resort for themselves, because they consider Montenegro their country and perceive Budva as their Sochi. They go to Abkhazia on vacation, but this territory froze in the 90s. Why don't the Russians pour money into it? And then what interest do they have there, except for swimming in the sea? And what are the Armenians doing there? Why do they go there?
In general, the Armenian ethnos is known as a business-like and hard-working and practical one. They love to work on the land, and from this point of view, this segment of agriculture was very developed for them here in Abkhazia. They import money, invest, and receive a certain profit for such activities. As for the Russians, I agree with you. The Russians have always considered Abkhazia their pearl. For them, it's like the best piece of cake, I'd say. Oh, well, mentally, the resort area of Abkhazia has always been occupied for them because, as you know, fabulous government residences are located there, which in terms of their infrastructure are really, really amazing. Most recently, government residences in Pitsunda were expropriated, and this was done as part of a very ridiculous agreement when the de facto government of Abkhazia handed it over, and they can already use them at their discretion. This means that Russia has already begun such a declared creeping occupation, or rather the annexation of strategically significant objects of Abkhazia. I doubt that anything can stop them. It has always been their expressed interest.
I want to ask you, how you worked for 6 or 7 years? Oh, 8. If this is a correct question, why did you leave? From your words, I drew a subjective conclusion for myself that you have lost faith and do not see the future. And especially in view of what is happening today and here in Georgia, these are government decisions and steps towards Russia and those desires of Russia in relation to the occupied territories that it demonstrates. What is happening? Why did you leave? And do you see the prospect of their return? What your president, Ms. Salome Zurabishvili, is declaring?
The reason for my resignation was a radical change in the environment of which I was a part of this system. Unfortunately, today, the external course of our government is so obviously wrong that I even feel embarrassed for the statements and for the expressed position that we hear daily from government representatives. And I, as a citizen, also experience this awkwardness. Naturally, the position of the current government does not represent the position of the Georgian people, and I am glad that today I can speak from the position of the people of Georgia about the horrors of the Russian occupation. Fortunately, we have a president who has a radically different course and often expresses the will of the Georgian people and voices the sentiments of almost than 85% of the population of Georgia.
I still would like to talk to you about your memories, because everyone has their own story, the final images that remained when leaving your home. How long have you not been home, and what did you leave behind? What do you remember as a teenager? I understand that over time the mind adds and modifies the picture, but what did you remember last?
September 27 is the day I left my city. That's what I call Sukhumi. And I like to mention it in the context because since childhood I have loved my city very much. It was not an ordinary love for the place where I was born. I somehow, in a special way, loved my street, my house, every nook and cranny where we walked and admired it every day. I don't know, I kind of felt like I had to live it, the most precious place in my life. It was the most terrible, most tragic day in my life when we were driving in a car along our street and already understood that everything was over. Prior to this, the bombing of Sukhumi lasted 13 months. The city was practically in a range and it was bombed from all sides. But you probably remember that on July 27, 1993, a trilateral ceasefire peace treaty was signed, and of course all parties assumed responsibility for not resuming hostilities and bringing these terrible, tragic events to an end. Of course, probably we all wanted to believe it, and the majority of the population who had been hiding in different cities for 13 months returned to Sukhumi. They returned because it had already been announced that the educational process was being resumed, that everything was returning to normal life. And we began to prepare for a new life, return to our house, and were already preparing for the start of a new school year. But in mid-August, unfortunately, the nightmare began again. This bombing. I remember that already in the first days, the second floor of our house was covered with shell marks, but we stubbornly didn't want to believe that this would happen. For some reason, we didn't want to believe that we were losing Sukhumi. The Gagra tragedy had already happened, fierce battles were already going on, and we understood that there's going to be a fall of Sukhumi. Of course, we all knew this, and those terrible facts of ethnic cleansing, but for some reason stubbornly didn't want to leave home. And now I will tell about it, actually for the first time in these 30 years. On the morning of September 27, there was no television or other means of communication at that time, but only radio was working, and the whole family listened to the news reports on the radio. It was the only means of communication with the outside world, because the telephone lines were no longer functioning, and in the morning, the commander-in-chief of our country, Mr. Eduard Shevardnadze, made a statement that not even a bird would fly into Sukhumi. I still remember that voice and that phrase. For us, this phrase was priceless because we deeply believed the first person of the state. And imagine, many, having heard this statement, generally changed their minds about leaving the city. But a few hours later, Dad got a call from headquarters and was told that Abkhazians had already entered the city and fighting was already underway in the center of the city. And we didn't even know about it. I was 15 years old then, and my sister was 14, and the youngest one was only 10 months old. I remember so well, I automatically took a 3-liter jar of powdered milk in one hand and held my little sister in the other. And then I don't remember what happened, how Dad put us in the car, how we left. This nightmare that was happening on the streets, roads broken by fragments of shells, burned houses, wounded and dead people were lying right on the street. We later learned that our neighbors were brutally tortured. Neither the bedridden old people, nor the children, nor the young were spared or saved. There was a tragedy that was simply indescribable in words. And in a miraculous way, with God's help, we managed to get out of the city and in the port of Gulripshi, where there were 5 or 6 small boats, comets it's called, and behind it stood a large Ukrainian warship. By some miracle, we were able to climb this little comet. We practically jumped into it. It was so overloaded, and it took a very long time to get to the place. But the most important thing that I definitely want to voice right now, and that I will never forget, is that when we climbed this comet and the door closed, small boats appeared near the shore on which machine guns were installed. I cannot say for sure who exactly it was, what ethnic groups, but they were people in the military uniforms. And some in broken Russian, some in good Russian language called on the captain of the ship to hand over this boat, comet, in which were civilians. I perfectly remember the appeal of the Ukrainian captain. He made a sign with his hand and ordered combat readiness. And he told our opponents, I repeat once again, I don't know what ethnic group they were, that they would be abandon us and would defend us to the end. And he gave the order that our little boat move away from the coast. We sailed for a very long time and arrived in Port Poti. Our boat Comet have become in Poti, and the Ukrainian ship with its vessel accompanied us. And so this terrible page in my life ended, but then the nightmare era of refugee began. Throughout all these years, I constantly thought about this Ukrainian captain. And even now, it is very difficult for me to talk about this. You know, this is a very emotional moment for me. I was just thinking to myself, I never brought this topic up with anyone. And I always dreamt that I would have the opportunity to thank this man. And now I'm happy that I have this opportunity to tell a Ukrainian journalist about this and thank the Ukrainian military men, the entire crew of the ship. his entire team who protected me personally and my family and saved us from death. And no one knows what kind of death it might be. And not only him. The Ukrainians were the ones who helped us Georgians during these hostilities. Many Ukrainians died in Abkhazia. They fought not with Abkhaz, but with the Russian Empire. Unfortunately, at that time, we were not yet fully aware and understood what this meant. Even then, they understood very well that it was ours, the Georgians, the war with the occupier. And the only nation that took our misfortune to hearts were the Ukrainians. And therefore, I feel my personal responsibility and duty to always be next to you, to Ukrainians, support and cheer for them, and wish them an unconditional victory. I don't doubt for a second that Ukraine will win this war, and we will all celebrate this great victory together.
Кому-то удалось избежать физического насилия.
Did anyone manage to avoid physical violence? Your fellow countrymen have told many scary stories, some about their neighbors, loved ones, or themselves. And after 30 years, it's probably psychologically easier. You also have your own stories, which we will have in 30 years, because not everyone is ready to talk about it openly now. What should women who have gone through all of this be prepared for? Were they able to cope with all of this on their own? I understand that this is a very difficult emotional question, but I am addressing you now as someone who headed a relevant ministry. From the perspective of medicine and psychological rehabilitation, is it possible to cope with this after 30 years? Is it possible to live with it?
You know, this trauma is very difficult to overcome, not even 30 years and perhaps even the rest of our life is not enough for this. On my personal example, I know for sure that I live with this. It has not gone anywhere. At that time, I needed a lot of help, professional help. When I was a teenager, shortly after the war, I personally couldn't cope with many problems and I needed the help of professional. I took advantage of this help, and I am definitely grateful to the person who then helped me in my rehabilitation. Most of all, after the hostilities, it will be necessary for those who have experienced the war firsthand, and first of all, I mean women, adolescents who have become victims of physical violence. Perhaps this is a global challenge. This will not be a local problem for Ukraine. This will be a global challenge for the health system. And so the whole world must unite and work together to overcome this barrier in order to help these people to cope with post-traumatic disorder, which is a prior expected and will definitely occur.
I would like to ask you at the end of our interview, here's everything you have just said and all these memories that will stay with you forever. Maybe my analogy will be wrong. And for some reason, this analogy with Chernobyl arose in me. Many people go to this zone, and for many who were children then, their memories froze at that moment, the moment of evacuation, and they are mostly terrible memories. Therefore, given your memories, I want to ask you, are you ready to return there? Do you have a place to return to? Because in fact, you will return to that hell of the final memories of your escape. Or do you see that all these can be cleaned up, rebuilt? But it will be another place. It will no longer be that homeland. Do you have a place to return?
I lived in a house built by my grandparents. They were the first residents in this place. Prior to that, this place was completely undeveloped. It was a long time ago. This is a hand-built house, my grandfather's. Then, of course, my dad contributed to its improvement and ennoblement. And for us, it was the most favorite place. My house had a beautiful courtyard. When my grandfather started building a house, he first of all planted a vine, which over time grew very large and formed a very beautiful canopy. And my grandmother planted very beautiful roses in front of the house. And after many, many years, we learned that this variety of roses is called baccarat, just like my last name. It was a very beautiful dark cherry rose with a delightful fragrance. And when the roses bloomed, this fragrance was felt everywhere. Grandmother was very fond of planting flowers, and the front of this courtyard was her paradise. Naturally, this place is akin to paradise for me, the most expensive, most priceless place on all earth. I never thought that we could not return there. Although a few years ago, my Abkhazian friend decided to please me and took a video of my house and sent it to me. He decided that he would please me with this. And I saw that in the place of my such an expensive flower garden, concrete is simply poured everywhere, and absolutely nothing happened there. For me, it was like the murder of my most cherished dream. That day, this man particularly destroyed me. Since then, I have not communicated with him, and he cannot understand why. Because the most nightmarish thing, which I didn't expect, he showed me in these frames, in this video. A family lives there. Naturally, we all know. We have detailed information about them. But I didn't think that when we return, I must definitely live in this house. We are ready to start everything from the very beginning. It doesn't matter exactly where. We knew for sure that we would manage to settle down here and start everything from the very beginning, and would be able to do everything that's necessary, because we're raising 5 children, and I know for sure that we have the resources to start everything from the beginning there too. It is very important, even from an emotional point of view, because we have the graves of relatives there. It's my grandfathers, grandmothers, and my 2 uncles. One of them, my mother's brother, died tragically in Sukhumi. He was only a few years older than me. The most painful thing for us, for our family, and especially for my mother, is this very moment that she cannot go to the grave of her parents, to the grave of her younger brother, who was brought up by her. This is especially acute when Easter comes. This is a traditional day when you have to visit the graves of dead people that are dear to you. And the more time passes, you realize that it doesn't heal. Time doesn't heal in any way. On the contrary, there is an even greater feeling of protest, and even more I want to return there. Mom's house, where she was born and raised, is now almost destroyed, but we know that we will return there and start everything from the very, very beginning. My children also grew up with the same faith. They identify themselves as Sukhumi. And my husband and I, who is also from Sukhumi, raise our children with such faith that if we cannot, they must, and they will be able to do it.
Thank you very much.
Ksenia, thank you very much.
Thank you for your sincerity and openness in this interview. I really appreciate it.